turned on the recording. So I want to say welcome to everyone who is here tonight. It is lovely to see everyone. This is our Northfield Cannon Falls League kickoff event for the year. Normally we kick off a little earlier in September, but this is a COVID year. So just the fact that we're doing this feels like an accomplishment in its own way. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. My name is Adrienne Falcon, and I am co-president with Pat Johnson. Pat, can you raise your hand there? And we are entering our, is it third year now doing this co-presidency? It's delightful to work with Pat. We also have many of our board members here. So as I say your name, maybe you can raise your hand in case folks know you. So Joan, Julia, John, Cinda is our official college connection to Carleton. Alyssa is in the room. St. Olaf is doing a watch party and she's on our board. Taya is also on our board through the Youth on Boards program. Anna is a Carleton student who is on our board. One moment, I have to go. So that is who we have with us. Julia, did I not say your name, Julia? So sorry.
No,
Julia,
you did.
Julia
You
and
said
Taya are our co-secretaries. So it's lovely to see you all here. Just a few things to share. We are excited. We have an energetic and dynamic board this year. We are thrilled to be doing this event on redistricting tonight and want to thank Paul and Susan for joining us. We're planning afterwards to at least write a letter to the editor of the Northfield News to share the findings. But this is only the first of numerous events this year. In early December, we will be organizing an event on climate change. And in January, we'll do our program planning where we figure out what are the next steps we're working on. And we have invited folks from Minneapolis to talk about dignity with dying and how to move a policy through the league efforts. And finally, then in February, we're currently planning a larger gathering around mental health and policing as the mental health and policing committee keeps doing their work. If you're interested in any of these particular topics, feel free to reach out. We would welcome your participation in any of our committees. Currently, the most active committee, I think, is the Policing and Mental Health Crisis Response. And Pat Johnson is also starting up again the letter writing. So that's yet another way to be involved. And Helene Hoppala and Amelia Arnold, we have a youth fellow working on voter registration this year. And Helene and Amelia will be leading, we're hoping to do almost monthly voter registration events. So lots of opportunities, lots of ways to get involved. If you are interested, just let one of us know. We would love to have you join us. And we still have David Emery. I want to acknowledge him while he's here too, who does reports from the hospital. So he is our observer there. And we thank you for that work that you do steadily and in an amazing way, keeping us informed on what is happening there. So thank you so much for that. In fact, it inspired us to think about potentially even doing a little more observer with the Rice County Board. And so if you are interested in that as well, please, again, you can reach out through the chat. You can reach out through email to our president email. Pat and I will respond to you with joy if you are interested in doing more. So with that, I want to just pause and say we are thrilled again to have a board that has someone from almost every decade of their life. There is no one under 10 and no one in their 40s. And otherwise, we've got almost every decade covered. So that's an exciting thing for us because it means that we truly get to talk across generations in exciting ways. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Joan to do formal introductions for tonight's program on redistricting and the results of the 2020 census. What do the results of the Census 2020 mean for Northfield, Rice County, Dakota County, and what are the implications for redistricting? So, Joan, take it away.
Well, we have two great guests with us this evening who can talk about different aspects of redistricting and what happens before and after redistricting. Susan Brower is the state demographer, and she directs the Minnesota State Demographic Center. She became the state demographer in 2012. Susan talks with Minnesotans about the new social and economic realities that are brought about by recent demographic shifts. Her work applies an understanding of demographic trends to changes in the state's economy and workforce, education, health, immigration, and rural population changes. Prior to joining the State Demographic Center, Susan was a researcher on the Minnesota Compass Project at Wilder Research. She also worked at the Population Studies Center at the University of Michigan, where she earned a PhD in sociology, specializing in demography and family sociology. She also has a master's degree in public policy from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. We're pleased to have her with us tonight. And our second guest is Paul Huffman, and Paul has been with the League of Women Voters Redistricting Coordinator since 2019. He is the coordinator, I should say. He works with national and state organizations to provide information, resources, and support to League of Women Voters Minnesota. And he is also working to involve the community to educate them and engage them and encourage participation in redistricting. He is a member of the Our Maps Minnesota Redistricting Campaign Steering Committee, and he is also a member of the League of Women Voters Minnesota Board of Directors, where he is the co-lead for voter service. Paul has a post-baccalaureate certificate in election administration from the University of Minnesota, Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and he served in the U.S. Navy as a nuclear submarine officer, retiring as a commander from the U.S. Naval Reserve, and he also retired from Xcel Energy in 2019 as general manager of the nuclear fleet operations. So a varied career on the part of Mr. Huffman, but he is also an expert on redistricting, which is why he is with us tonight. So I'll turn it over to you, the two of you now, and we'll begin with Susan.
Hello, good evening, everyone. It's great to see everyone. I'll just thank you, Joan, for that nice introduction. I'll just add two pieces of information that are not in my formal biography because it connects me to Northfield, and that is that I went to St. Olaf as an undergraduate. That's why I was so interested. Yay! That's why I was so interested in what room that was, because I don't remember that. At least it didn't look like that when I was there. But anyway, thank you, St. Olaf, for joining us tonight. Thank you all. I was chit-chatting earlier too. I met my husband when I was going to St. Olaf, so I feel like Northfield is absolutely kind of the core home base of where our family started. So now I have a couple of teenage kids, and that's me outside of being a demographer. I first want to say that Northfield in particular was a powerhouse in terms of census outreach. We're going to look at the response rates that we saw in Minnesota and across a little bit around your area of the state. But in general, there was just so much energy and so much support, not only from, the Northfield's Complete Count Committee, but Adrian and Cinda's work as well with connecting to college students. I'm sure many of you were involved, or I think many of you may have been involved in that as well. The League of Women Voters was an amazing partner as we did census outreach. It was this energetic army of people who were unleashed into the world to to convince people how important the census was, and it was really invaluable, as we will kind of see what happened in just a moment. So I'm going to share my slides with you now. Okay, and so the first thing that I want to tell you is that Minnesota led the nation in terms of census response, self-response. So this is the percent of households that returned to the census form without any additional prompting from census takers. And 3/4 of Minnesota's households did that. compared with 67% nationally. So an amazing turnout. I love this map because Minnesota sticks out all by itself in that one color blue. I'm thinking about having that tattooed on my arm, but I haven't done it yet. It's tattooed into my brain for sure. But we've always had really good self-response to the census, because people are in Minnesota generally are civically oriented toward, you know, all kinds of activities that relate to voting and civic engagement. But this one in particular was really something special, I think, and really involved many people across the state. If we look decade by decade at census self-response rates, we typically would expect them to be going down decade over decade over decade. And that's because in general, people have, they're less likely to respond. There's lower self-response rates to surveys. And so the Census Bureau itself plans that each decade there will be lower and lower response, as there are all these kinds of factors that would keep people away from their mail and answering their census forms. It increases the likelihood that they will not respond. But what we actually saw here in Minnesota in many different communities, as you see across the board here, is an overall increase in self-response relative to the last census. And that's truly amazing, I think, given just what was going on with this census. As the forms hit the mailboxes, we were kind of reeling from the impact of COVID. It was just starting to unfold. People were moving, students, classes were shutting down, and students were going remote. So there was all kinds of disruptions that we normally wouldn't have had, but we still had, you know, this really great response rate historically and compared to the nation overall. You can see that, you know, Rice County's response rate increased considerably since 2010 from 75 to 78%. Northfield a whopping almost 82%. Cannon Falls actually lowered a little bit, but it was very high at 83%. So we've really just got a lot of census participation going on across this area of the state and in Minnesota as well. And one of the results from from having such an incredible census response rate was that Minnesota was able to keep all 8 of its congressional districts. It did so by counting just 20, this says 28, it's actually 26 people. I must have had just a episode of forgetfulness come over me when I was typing this. It actually was 26 people that we kept that 8th congressional district by. And so if you had any conversation encouraging people to fill out their census, if you worked on the phone bank, even if you filled out your census yourself, you can absolutely feel responsible for keeping all 8 of our congressional seats. I will definitely back that belief. Minnesota's population was just over 5.7 million. And if we look across the state where the growth happens, it kind of gives us a sense of what needs to happen during this redistricting cycle. The growth was very concentrated in the metropolitan areas, particularly in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. So the very darkest areas of blue on this map are showing the counties that gained population, with Hennepin County there in the very darkest color blue gaining over 129,000 people. The state overall gained about 402,000 people. So you can see more than a quarter of the growth was concentrated right in Hennepin County. But we also see growth, you know, along the southern corridor toward Rochester, including Rice County, including Dakota County. And we also see it up along the I-94 corridor across to St. Cloud. I think if I move my cursor around, you may be able to see it. along the I-94 corridor to the St. Cloud metropolitan area. And if we continue on to the area of Clay County, where Fargo and Moorhead, well, Moorhead is located, the Fargo metro is located right up here. So most of our growth this decade was really concentrated in those metropolitan areas. It's really concentrated even beyond the metros, really in a few suburban cities and a few urban cities right in the center of the core of Hennepin and Ramsey counties. And just to give you a sense of kind of how uneven that growth was across the state, and to give you a sense of kind of the redistricting process that needs to redistribute folks into equal sized districts, we see that 78% of the growth is concentrated in the 7-county metro. These bubbles represent the size of the growth that happened in each of the 87 counties in Minnesota. If you see a red bubble on this graphic, it means that that county lost population, and the blue bubbles mean that those counties gained population. And so when you start to see kind of those counties that are big enough to be labeled and have a number on them, most of them are located in the 7-county metropolitan area. We also see, Olmsted County, which includes Rochester. We see Wright, which is kind of just an extent, not quite part of the Twin Cities, but kind of just part of that whole economic ecosystem. And so the story of the growth this decade really is a story of metro growth and of urban growth, but not exclusively. We can see here the counties in your region of the state. Northfield has a small portion of its residents living in Dakota County. It's about 5%, just over about 1,000 of its 20,000 residents live in Dakota County. So I've included that here, but you can see that each of these counties and cities that are in your region of the state have grown over the last decade. Northfield grew by 783 people and a growth rate of about 4%. The state's growth rate overall was 7.6%. So some of these growth rates are a little bit lower than that average, but in general, for being outside of the metropolitan area, even though it's kind of greater Twin Cities, for being where it is in the state and holding on to that level of growth, I think it did very well for itself in terms of those growth numbers. I want to look a little bit at the racial composition, the changing racial composition of the area, because it mirrors very much what's happening across the rest of the state. And that is that we are seeing in Rice County and in Northfield a decline in the number of white non-Hispanic residents and continued growth in the number of BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color residents. And you can see that the number of people of color went from about 9,600 to about 15,600 over the course of the decade, and that there was just a very slight decline in the number of white non-Hispanic residents. Now, when I start talking about declines and gain and additions in the population, people's minds almost immediately go to migration. Who's moving to the area? Who's moving away to the area? But I can assure you that most of the change in racial composition, most of it, not all of it, but most of it is due to the number of people, the people who are already living in the area, and whether they are in the age groups to have more children, which increases the diversity of the state if you have more people of color in the parenting ages, or you have more people who are white non-Hispanic in the older age groups who are more likely to be in the high mortality age groups. They're more likely to pass away. So I know that's like very grim for our League of Women Voters, but I just want you to, for our meeting, but I just wanted you to understand the mechanics of how our state is changing It really has to do with just the natural progression of life and deaths, births and deaths, of people moving through those parenting ages and then moving into those high mortality age groups. This decline in the white population and growth in populations of color is something that we're seeing across the state and across many other smaller geographies, counties. I think we saw it in Northfield as well, a very small decline in the white non-Hispanic population and growth in populations of color. And the same kind of mechanism that creates this change is something that has momentum to it. So we know that there will be, for the coming decades, more people who are white non-Hispanic in those older age groups. So we know that we'll probably see a decline in the white non-Hispanic population going forward. And we know we have more people in the younger ages and the parenting ages who are likely to have children of their own. And so we'll see continued growth in populations of color just because of who is already living here right now. If we look kind of across at a little bit more detail in the Northfield area, we see that the Black or African American population grew by about 370 people. The Native or Indigenous or American Indian population just about doubled. The Asian or Pacific Islander grew a bit by 350. Most of the growth that was in the Northfield, the city of Northfield, is attributable to Latinos, to that growth. So it went from about 1,700 in 2010 to about 2,600 in 2020. Another group that grew quite a bit is the group that identified as having identifying with two or more race groups. And that's something that we've seen across the state as well, is increased diversity, not only within each of these groups, but across groups as well. For Cannon Falls, the picture is not as kind of pronounced. That same kind of pattern is not as pronounced. In fact, the white population stayed almost the same over time. But you can see that where there was growth, or where there was more growth, it was among populations of color, kind of jointly. That's where the joint, if you consider all of those populations of color as a group, you see that being kind of the real growth factor for Cannon Falls as well. So before I turn it over to Paul, I just want to walk through some of what we will expect to see in terms of redistricting because of our population shifts. The first thing we need to know is, because we kept all 8 congressional districts, it means our districts are considerably more compact than they otherwise would be. Because rather than splitting the state's population up into, 7 equal pieces, we're splitting it into 8 equal pieces. So that reduces the population size of each of these districts by about 100,000. So that's a good thing. It's still, these districts have still grown over time because the state has grown over time. And so now each of these districts, as the committees and as the courts move through the process of deciding where these lines are drawn, will need to come as close as possible to 713, 312 people. And we're looking across the districts, we see that the districts that grew the most tend to be those districts that are the urban districts, the Twin Cities districts, including the district number 2 that Northfield is a part of, which grew by almost 70,000 people over the last 10 years. Districts 1, 8, and 7 are more rural districts. They tend to be along they're on the southern edge, northern Minnesota, the southwestern edge, and the southern edge of the state. And that's where we saw less population growth overall. Those districts will need to expand considerably more than other districts, which will need to do their own expansion to meet that ideal population size. And then if we look at state Senate districts across the board, it mirrors pretty closely what I was showing you earlier with county to county growth. We see this kind of edge along the outside of the Twin Cities metropolitan area. If we were to zoom in, we'd see the districts around Minneapolis and St. Paul also had considerable growth. But the Mankato area, the Rochester area, and up toward Clay County, where, you know, the Moorhead side of that metro are the darkest greens. And so that many of those districts will need to contract in geographic size, whereas the yellow and cream districts will need to expand in geographic size because they're below that ideal population size for state Senate districts. And so looking at the districts, the state Senate districts that Northfield and Cannon Falls are part of, 58, 20, and 21, we really see quite a range in terms of growth patterns. All grew somewhat over the course of the last decade. 58 grew considerably and will need to shrink down in size to meet that 85,172. 20 grew by about, you know, just over 6,000, just under 6,000, and District 21 was less growth, but still one of the areas that grew. If we look at the population, the difference of those populations from that ideal, you can see kind of just what needs to happen in terms of redistricting. So if it were only up to those districts themselves, 58 would need to shrink by about 6,000, and 20 would need to grow just by a hair. 21 would need to grow by about 4,000 to meet that ideal population size of 85,172. Now, the way that redistricting works, of course, and maybe we'll hear more about this from Paul, is that if we have a neighboring district that needs to grow considerably, it may have ripple effects. So even though 20, for example, is very close to where it needs to be, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stay exactly, those boundaries are going to stay right where they are, because if there's growth, of course, on the northern edge of that district or right above it, there may be implications because of neighboring districts that need to change their boundaries. So this is generally just giving you a picture of where your districts are with respect to growth and some of the work and kind of complexity that is needing to be considered as those map lines are being redrawn. And so with that, I will stop my share and turn it over to Paul. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Susan. That was great. And you know, I met Susan and her staff as part of the census work, as she talked about. I was working with the League of Women Voters Minnesota, and as part of the Census Mobilization Partnership, which the Demographic Center was a key part of leading. And you know, in the league, and I want to thank, you know, you members of the league who participated and supported that effort throughout the state. Number of people, you know, did outreach to the community, did phone banking, just a whole bunch of things to help get people out. So it was just a great statewide partnership to do that. I'll share my screen here. And what I'm going to do is do a deep dive into you know, local redistricting. And so Susan has provided an overview of the state and the demographic changes of the state. And I'll give you a sense of where we are in the process statewide and then locally, and then some details locally, because that is probably where the greatest opportunity for impact is at this point in the redistricting cycle. My email is on here, phuff@lwvmn.org, and I'll say that at the end again. I'm always available to meet, talk, discuss, provide information if you're interested in more information about redistricting, how it works, what the process is, how it works in other states, and so on. So a very complicated subject, so it's got a very condensed discussion this evening, focused really on local redistricting. You know, first thing is the timeline. I'll just note that The House and the Senate are likely drafting maps this winter. The House is done with accepting testimony. There are a couple of hearings in the House next week and the week after. They haven't announced the agenda. My guess is those will be discussions of drawing maps because the House Redistricting Committee has approved principles. So they're moving through the process of having draft maps. The Senate has only had a couple of meetings or hearings with the public. We do expect they're going to have at least one more hearing, although they haven't announced that yet. And we suspect the Senate will also draft the maps. It is extremely unlikely that the House and the Senate are going to agree on principles or maps. The House is taking a much different direction on principles than the Senate had during their session. But that gives you a sense of where we are in process, and the opportunity for engagement right now is with the Senate when and if they have another hearing. Just as an aside, the courts are in their process. They've completed accepting public comment and public input. There is an opportunity for the public to submit maps. There's some pretty stringent requirements. If somebody's interested in more information, you let me know. The deadline for that is the 30th of November. And really it's now between the court and the plaintiffs in the lawsuit on the redistricting, and expect that there'll be some arguments this fall, and then oral arguments are scheduled the 4th of January. And then we'll hear nothing from the court until mid-February, as I'll talk about here in a moment. What's really happening now is, in addition at state level, with talking about Congress and the legislature, is city and county governments deciding on how they're going to do local redistricting and going about redrawing their lines. And in this window, from October through really January, those local governments are training staff, they're assembling their redistricting data, they're defining process and schedule, defining, and scheduling hearings if they're going to do that, and then potentially drafting maps. Currently, with the exception of knowing what the final legislative boundaries are, cities and counties have everything they need in order to do redistricting in accordance with Minnesota state law. So, there shouldn't be any misunderstanding about what's available to local governments and do they have what they need? They do. And there's some great resources available both from the Secretary of State's office and from the Demographer's office to help local governments and the public with understanding changes in population. And I'm going to go through some data here in a moment, but all of that comes from either the Secretary of State's website or from the State Demographic Center website. So I just highly commend those resources to you if you're interested in looking further. So while this is all going on, I mentioned the court is having, they're taking their input from the parties to the lawsuit, taking testimony, oral arguments. Mid-February, if the governor and the legislature don't agree on maps, which I don't see any scenario in which that occurs, the courts are going to issue legislative and congressional maps. That's in bold because that is what's going to happen. That's what happened in the last two redistricting cycles in 2002 and 2012. And so we fully expect that's what's going to happen this cycle also. There is some confusion even among legislators about what the deadline is or what's going to happen. Mid-February, there will be maps either from the legislature or the courts. There's a legal requirement to have that by a certain point, 25 weeks prior to the primaries, which are in August. Once those lines are drawn, that enables local governments to finalize maps. And I use that word finalize very deliberately because they will likely have draft maps all done and just waiting for those legislative maps to be done, because what the city and counties have to do is then finalize precinct boundaries, because precinct boundaries cannot cut across legislative or congressional boundaries. So, so if you're in a precinct voting, the ballots in the precinct will not have more than one legislative district or more than one House district on it. You could have multiple school districts, which I have been in that situation. I'm an election judge also. And so We do get ballots that have, a precinct that may have more than one school district, but not more than one legislative district and not more than one congressional district. The deadline for those lines to be drawn is the end of March for the cities and end of April for counties. So that's a very tight timeline. But again, they've got all the information that they need now. They can draft maps now, and they can be taking public input, which I'll talk about, in order to be ready. I want to go back, and there was a really excellent program that the league did in June on redistricting, and Peter Watson, who is one of the parties in the lawsuit, longtime Senate counsel for the state of Minnesota, was on that, as well as a member of the Rice County staff. And there's a lot of information about redistricting, but we want to make sure that everybody understands why redistricting is important and why is there some urgency to this and why does it merit your attention. Redistricting is about representation of communities. We tend to think about parties, but especially we're talking about local redistricting. Those are not nominally partisan positions. They are elected to represent the day-to-day interests of the residents of the city and the county across a wide range of services and policies that impact the day-to-day lives of those residents. The way those lines are drawn, it determines what voices are heard and what policy interests are served around those. It also determines who is elected. And if lines are drawn in ways that don't provide opportunities for minority groups, historically underrepresented groups to gain representation, then those voices are not at the table. Those groups, and these are terms generally called cracking and packing and redistricting, if they are diluted, split among geographic areas, or isolated or concentrated in one district or another, then those voices may not be heard and effectively represented. And the last thing I want to point out is that you have to think about policy interests, not party interests. The policy interests of parties change over time. The Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party has farmer in their name, but they aren't necessarily very aligned right now with farm interests. They want to be, but the question is how those policy interests are aligning at this point. The Republican Party is historically not necessarily been the farmer aligned party, but currently the rural areas are much more Republican oriented than historically. So that just shows you how policy interests change over time between the parties. And so if you focus on what's important to you from a policy standpoint, that's going to be more effective when you talk about redistricting. Local redistricting, I talked about this a little bit, all the things that happen at local level. In counties, I was in a call last month, a panel discussion, and one of the folks talked about counties being the forgotten level of government. So many things get done at the county level with transit, transportation, medical, mental, public health services, social services, juvenile services, public safety, infrastructure, jails. All those things happen at the county level. Some of that implementation happens locally at the city, but much more of that happens at the county level. Locally, as opposed to the state level, you're much more likely to be able to contact and engage local government officials. And I'll talk about how many county commissioners there are, for example, between each resident. And so there's a lot fewer of you for each one of them. So you got a lot better chance to engage them. As a result, you're more likely to be able to influence local government. And there's opportunities for minority representation and leadership development. For many elected officials, that local government, the city council, the county commission, school boards, that is the entry point for people to elected office to develop that long-term interest and ability. An example, there's many examples I could give you, just one to help you understand how this can make a difference. Minneapolis in 2000 redistricting. In Minneapolis, they have wards just as Northfield does. There, the county commission draws the lines, which is a non-elected body. Prior to 2010, the way the lines are drawn, on the left is the Powderhorn area. In Minneapolis, that is a majority minority area. The largest minority group is Hispanic. That area was divided between 4 different wards. Also very populous there in the northeast part of that is the American Indian community, To the north west and the northeast is the East African Somali community. So a lot of minorities there. Because those areas were split up, they did not have an opportunity for minority representation. To the right is Cedar Riverside. That area is majority minority and it's majority Black. That also was split between 4 different wards, with the result that, again, there wasn't an opportunity for representation. So what changed? In 2010, the Minneapolis voters approved a citizen redistricting advisory group. That group supported the redistricting efforts committee of the Charter Commission. And the result was the lines were drawn differently to reflect what the policy needs and the community interests were of the people of Minneapolis. And they had then the first Somali city council member representing Cedar Riverside, the first Hispanic city council member, and then the first Hmong city council member. So again, a much more diverse city council, much more representative of the people of Minneapolis and the varied interests of the people. So that gets to the importance and the relevance of local redistricting. So suggestions on what to do. The suggestion is to approach local government. Start with the state, your local staff, the county and the city, focus on the process. Ask about what hearings will be held. Ask about redistricting principles. Several cities and counties have done that. Minneapolis has principles. The city of Rochester is adopting redistricting principles. Washington County is adopting principles. That is a way to provide greater detail to how the redistricting decisions will be made and rules around that, so that it's clear how the interests of the public will be addressed as part of that. The second thing I would suggest is ask about opportunities for public involvement. Any efforts at community organizing and communicating to county commissioners or city council isn't effective if there isn't an opportunity for involvement and input before maps are drafted, comments on draft maps, and comments on maps before they're going to be approved. And there are processes that other locations have adopted to varying degrees that can help with that. Some other things to do: consider reviewing existing maps. I'll give you some examples of that. Research census data. I can provide information on that. Dr. Brower also provided some information, but some things you can see to how things have changed and what might be beneficial to your community. Attend public hearings. Elected officials really respond to interest from the community. And then finally, partner with other community organizations. No organization, whether it's a League of Women Voters or a student group at St. Olaf, can do this alone. Only by having a broader coalition of groups can we have that effective input and influence the decision making. A couple of things to consider with challenges: most local governments are not accustomed to public involvement and interest. This is something that's flown below the radar historically, unless you're in a place like Minneapolis. This had that attention. Most counties, people are unaware this is going on, and most cities as well. Some local government officials are resistant to public involvement and transparency. They are accustomed to and more comfortable with doing this really in a more closed manner. There are limited requirements for local redistricting. Legally, it's very limited, so there's a lot of latitude, just as it is with redistricting at the state level, a lot of latitude for potential abuse of that redistricting process. And then you have to engage your local government to get information, because in many cases, and in fact most cases, the local government won't volunteer what they're doing, how they're doing it, when they're doing it. And finally, I'll say you have to act now, because as I said, local governments have all the information they need. They may or may not be getting underway with this. If they haven't, and that's great, because now it's a great time to influence how they're going to do this process going forward. A couple of things to consider, and I'll mention this is a once every 10-year activity. Many folks may have never done this or have not done it in a long time. It's a part-time job. Nobody has this as their full-time gig. I'm doing this virtually full-time, but that's, I have that ability. There are experts out there to do this virtually full-time, but not your local and local governments. In most cases with staffs, they're going to focus on legal requirements in their past practice, and that's as expected. And they weren't going to do things differently unless elected officials are approving or encouraging that change in direction, because that's going to have fundamental changes in how those elected officials do their jobs. So just be aware that the staffs are a great place to focus. And I will tell you from my time in the business world, staffs can be incredibly valuable and helpful if you work in partnership and collaboration amicably with them. They can be a tremendous help. If you behave in a confrontational way, they can certainly hinder what you're trying to accomplish. So approach them politely, be receptive, and understand the constraints that they're likely working under. Elected officials frequently aren't going to know the details. May not have been in office last time redistricting was done. They may not know. And in fact, I found my own legislator isn't aware of the redistricting process and the timeline. So expect they're not going to know the details. They're not going to know terms like community of interest, and just present them with facts on the process, the legal requirements, and availability of data, just to help provide a fuller perspective. And then if you do provide comments on redistricting, these are some tips. This information is available from the Brennan Center. We have it on our website, and I'll put here after I'm done, a link to our local redistricting action kit, provide more information. So just on how to provide that input. What I'm going to show you is a couple of maps just to give you some perspective. Susan gave you some information, kind of a tabular format. Sometimes maps are really helpful, and these will be available to everybody after the fact to use because there's a lot of data there. It's pretty dense. But what you see is that there are a couple of areas of Rice County that gained greater population than others, and therefore those areas are over what the ideal population is. You see that the ideal district population is about 13,000. So that means there's one commissioner every 13,000 of you that lives in Rice County. So that's pretty good access. You look at Faribault and Northfield, those two cities together are about 2/3 of Rice County. So that tells you something about the political power that should reside in those cities. Broken down in a tabular manner, but one of the things I find fascinating, and I look at this all over the state, is the difference in demographics between the cities and the rural areas. And what that tells you is Faribault is 34% non-white. If you look at the number the census has about non-Hispanic white, basically take the obverse of that. That's how many people identify as something other than non-Hispanic white. Greater than 1/3 of the people of Faribault. Over 1/4 of Northfield identifies. Greater Rice County, outside of those two cities, it's about 8%. Big delta between those cities. So that tells you that the policy interests are likely going to be much different in Faribault and Northfield than they are going to be in Greater Rice County. In Northfield, just this show, there's redistricting in the city. What you see is Ward 3, which is the northern part, and that goes across into Dakota County. There's about 1,200 residents of Ward 3 in Dakota County. That ward has got to actually get a little bigger if they're going to equalize population. Ward 2 in the southern part of the city is going to have to get a little smaller. So just something to be aware of. So that helps you with the metrics about what the city council is going to be faced with. Dakota County is an interest because Northfield goes into Dakota County. Just to be aware, that is the 3rd most populous county in the state. That Southern Commissioner District, District 1, had the most growth other than District 7, which is Apple Valley, Lakefield, which has seen a lot of growth, and that's kind of the I-35 corridor through Burnsville and Lakeville around Apple Valley. So again, those districts that have not gained as much. And what I see throughout the state, and I swapped emails with Susan probably a month or so ago, is that a lot of the urban cores did not grow as much as the suburbs. We see this in Rochester, we see it in the Minneapolis and St. Paul. The suburbs are where a lot of the growth is occurring. That's what you're seeing here is these places like West St. Paul, they are growing less because they are basically more developed. A lot of people living further out. So it tells you something about those moves. And this again is more detail. What I looked at as the county as a whole, and Dakota County became, as Susan said, more diverse over the last 10 years. Goodhue County, Cannon Falls, for those of you in Cannon Falls, again, some shifts in population. Again, and you know your community better than I do, but you can see that growth in the southeastern part of Goodhue County and how those lines are going to have to change. And then Goodhue County even becoming more diverse, just as all of Minnesota is becoming more diverse. So that gives you just a really fast overview of where we are with redistricting in Minnesota, and then local redistricting and suggestions about what you might do in order to get engaged. So that I'll turn it back to the league and wait for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan and Paul, so much for these excellent presentations. I feel informed in a very different way than I did even before. It's lovely, right? Susan came and joined us with Marcia Avner in the spring of 2019 to launch our census efforts. And there's a lovely sense of closure now when you are able to come back and tell us, you know, what the results have been. And then Paul, for you to add on the layer of redistricting and the local implications. This is so helpful for all of us. So thank you. While I was talking, I hope that people have been coming up with questions that you can put in the chat, and we will take them from there. So let's see. While folks are thinking of that first question, which I am assuming that questions will start to flow in the last 5 minutes, so you really got to get it in there if you want it. We reached out before this to both our city and our county to try to understand better what was happening with redistricting, and it sounds like they're at the very, very, very preliminary starting point. So do you have any suggestions about even how we would go about trying to engage with our locals? So we've reached out to them to say, where are you at with the process? But how would you suggest launching that conversation so that it can be a polite conversation?
Thanks, Adrian. My suggestion initially would be, to ask the question about, what is their plan on what the process is going to be. A lot of times they may not have thought about that. And then, they may, say, well, we're just going to do our work and we'll draw maps in March, which I think is not likely what's going to happen, or draw maps in February. So it's said to provide suggestions about, have you considered taking public input? I can provide examples. The city of Rochester and Olmsted County both have input sites to provide information for redistricting. Washington County is providing an input portal. So there's some examples of what local governments have done. And just again, it might be helpful to send, if they haven't or aren't considering principals, to send a letter. And I've got an example that was done by one of our leagues, sending a letter to county commissioners on suggestions on principles. Really it starts with engaging commissioners on, hey, here's what we're interested in. I think, it may occur that they will be receptive to that if the question is asked. At least then you'll know. I think given the timing, it's important to start engaging elected officials, city council members, ask them, what their plans are, or tell them you'd like to have the opportunity for public input on those.
Great, thank you. And the questions are starting. So yes, clearly we would want the letter for county commissioners. So please do share that with us, Paul. And I think Claudia asked a question about West St. Paul. It sounds, Claudia, like you, like the same suggestions that Paul just made for us locally in Northfield would apply for you in West St. Paul. St. Olaf students ask, we're wondering, and this could be for either one of you, what do you suspect the implications are for our congressional districts in Northfield? Paul or Susan, who would like to take that one?
Yeah, that's great. What I need to do is pull up the map. I'm trying to remember. If I recall, Northfield is in CD2 currently. And I think the betting is that you will still be in CD2. I'm trying to remember where you are, where that.
We're at the southern end of CD2.
Yeah, it depends on, it really, yeah, I apologize for not having that congressional map. It depends on what the court does with CD 7 and 8. There is a proposal from the plaintiffs in the suit, and this is a map that's on the Legal and Voter site for comment, that would have CD 7 go further west, encompass the Indian tribal communities in northern Minnesota. Potentially, CD 7 could go all the way down to the southern border, because there is an argument made that CD 7, that whole western side has more in common than southern and southeastern Minnesota, and then CD 1 would then move more northeast. There's an argument made for that. Some testimony that was provided in Rochester focused on that, was the interest in the common geography and interests of southeastern Minnesota. So I think that that's going to be a question about as CD2 gets smaller, CD2 is going to go closer to metro. It's going to become a more suburban, ex-urban district, go less rural. CD1 may take more of southeast Minnesota if CD7 takes the western side. So you could end up in CD1 as opposed to CD2. Mm-hmm. That's the guessing. Great.
And Janet Petrie says Faribault is in CD1, Northfield in CD2. Some don't like a county to be split, so that there's some perspective on that.
Yeah.
So
one thing I'll mention when I know we're like out of time is it depends on what the interests are. Washington County, where I am, is divided into 3 different House districts right now, but it's very different north to center to south. Rice County seems much more consistent in interests, and therefore I would kind of anticipate it'll all be CD1 when lines are done.
Okay. So there are there's several more questions about, and I would say let's take 2 more. There are 2 more sort of generally in the chat. So if we can talk for about 3 more minutes. One question is about, well, a quick question is, a couple of times, Paul, you have mentioned the lawsuit. Can you explain just a bit about what the lawsuit is that you have referred to?
Certainly. Each decade, really going back to 1990, there's been a lawsuit filed once the apportionment it gets done, in court, saying that the congressional and legislative maps are unconstitutional because they're no longer equal, and therefore need to be redrawn. Those lawsuits generally are put aside, waiting for the legislature to do work. What's happened in the 2000 and 2010 cycles is that the legislature and the governor aren't progressing toward agreeing. So the court starts work in the summer and then does that. The lead plaintiff for that is Peter Watson, who I mentioned, and a number of other folks who are redistricting experts and citizen representatives. The League of Women Voters is a co-plaintiff on that. There are other parties to this. The Republican Party is an intervener. The DFL party is a party. There also is a group aligned with Common Cause, which is a number of minority underrepresented communities, also a party. So that lawsuit is created in order to get the court to act on drawing redistrict state level districts should the legislature not do it. The benefit of filing that for an individual organization is you're basically at first in the line at the table to have your voice heard.
Thank you. So there are several questions about communities of interest and the challenge therein. Like, does it, which I think is actually in some ways a much, much bigger topic, but, you know, so how do you, it seems like splitting or not splitting a community can become challenging in terms of understanding how communities are seen as such, right? Where as a warning sign of a problem, lines dividing neighborhoods that we experience as contiguous or coherent communities. So I think how you define community, how do you come to what an understanding of a community of interest is, maybe is part of the question.
That's a great question, because there are overlapping communities of interest. You know, communities of interest are groups of people in a geographic area having a shared ethnic, national, religious, cultural, economic, financial interest. It could be a school district. It could be people who live in a suburban area who all work in a city. It could be people in a rural area who all are in extractive industries. In Northeast Minnesota, you got extractive industries co-located with people involved in natural resource preservation. So those are two different conflicting communities of interest. You know, in Minneapolis, I've worked with groups on mapping that include the Native American community, the East African community, the Hispanic community, and they all overlap in some areas. And so what you have to decide is how best to draw the maps to give voice to the most numerous community. That is more art than science. You know, you can get data, but you have to talk to people. You know, the comment there, Ken, is it a form of gerrymandering? If it is providing a representative, equitable representation, that is not gerrymandering. That's the opposite of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is where you are skewing maps to provide unrepresentative elections, where a group or a party is overrepresented. An example of that, I would argue, is Olmsted County, where the maps are drawn with the objective of balancing urban and rural interests amongst the county commission, even though the city of Rochester is 3/4 of the population. And so all 7 of the county commissioner districts have a piece of Rochester. So as a result, minority communities, the urban communities don't have the effective voice in the county decision-making. So it's a matter of determining how to effectively represent those communities that are in an area. And so then you have to determine how best to do that through input of the people.
That's a fabulous example. Thank you. So as we go out, Susan, I have one question for you, just to give, because I also want to hear from you beyond redistricting, given the demographic changes that your data shows in Northfield, Rice County, Dakota County, what other issues do you think that we will be facing in the next few years as we think about how do we take in this data and anticipate what may come for us as an area?
Yeah, so I think we'll have another round of data next year that give us more information about the type of people who are within each of those broad racial groups. So we'll have more information about the age of people and about their national origin, you know, more about household relationships, you know, family relationships, those kinds of things. So all that detail comes next year. But in general, we know that kind of the big trends are going to show up in those data because we've been tracking them for decades and know that they'll still be there when those data come out. So I would say, you know, continued urbanization is one, you know, long-term trend that we know will likely continue. We have continued to see just with the redistricting data. We'll also see kind of greater diversity, particularly among, at least statewide, among Black or African American residents of the state. That was our fastest growing group, and are likely to see continued diversity growth within the group of Black or African Americans in the state. And then there are issues around aging that we will see and experience, and that kind of intersects with, you know, urbanicity and rural Minnesota as well too. So there's a lot going on there, and it's just continuing to unfold as it has been in past decades. But we'll get an update next year.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. I hope, Susan, that we can continue to have you back to kind of keep giving us these perspectives. And Paul, we very, very clearly will be reaching out to you to get help in the next few months. So you're up as our first contact, and Susan, we hope to keep bringing you back to this place you care about. So thank you both. Thank you to the League members who joined us tonight, and we look forward to figuring out how to continue to work with this data, how to continue to encourage community participation in redistricting. And one final plug, should you get an American Community Survey, the decennial census comes every 10 years, but the American Community Survey may come sooner. Please respond if you receive it.
Please do.
So on that note, I thank you all and look forward to seeing you in December for a talk about what is happening around climate change work in the state. Thank you all. Feel free to reach out.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.